Hi, everybody. We are now on the last part of Unit 2. This is Chapter 11. Okay, so we're talking about changes in societies. Mostly we're focused on Britain, France, and the US. So in Britain, in 1815 in Britain was a constitutional monarchy. What that means is they had a king, but they also had elected government officials that mostly made the decisions or helped make the decisions. But here's the thing. It wasn't really democracy because almost no one could vote. Only 5% of the people could vote. So can you really call your country a democracy if only 5% of the people can vote? I don't think so. Neither do historians. And so there were all kinds of, there was political strife. Some people were really fighting to let other people vote, and other people were saying, no, just us need to vote, because it was mostly, rich white men that could vote. And they thought, well, how come we should let other people vote? We're the rich white men. We're the ones that run everything. We should be the ones that vote. Well, by 1832, most white men could vote. Most white men, not all of them, but most of them. And I just lied to you. Sorry. Most white men with land could vote. It wasn't until the 1890s that most men could vote. So in 1815, only 5% of all men could vote. By 1832, most men that owned land could vote. And by the 1890s, most men could vote. In 1807, Britain abolished, that means to end, abolished the slave trade. This is a big deal. It doesn't mean you can't own a slave. What it means is you can't buy or sell a slave. So all the slaves that you already have stay in slavery. And if those slaves have children, they're also your slave. Slavery is a creepy thing. People actually owned people. Just like I have a cat and a dog. People had people. They had like human beings that were their property. So in 1807, Britain ended the sale. You can't buy and you can't sell a slave. It wasn't until 1833, I believe, yes, 1833, that slavery was banned in all British lands. So this means all their colonies, anything that was run by the British government, slavery was done. Also during the 1800s, I'm really doing a very, very broad talk of changes. The industrial age was basically the entire 1800s. So I'm talking to you about all the way from the year 1800 to the year Really, I'm going up to about 1920, that time. But in the in the early 1800s, the most common punishment for crime was death. You were put to death. If you stole a loaf of bread, you were put to death. If your child was dying and you stole medicine for your child, you were put to death. If you killed someone, you were put to death. If you, I don't know, killed someone's horse, you were put to death. Like, death was what people did. But by the mid 1800s, they had calmed down a little bit on that. By like 1850, they reserved the death penalty for the really serious things. If you murdered your neighbor's wife, they would put you to death for that. But other people, other criminals, lots of them were sent to penal colonies. A penal colony is a prison, kind of like a prison town. And Britain used Australia as a penal colony. Britain had taken control of Australia, and they just sent all their criminals there. They're like, oh yeah, okay, you can steal, but we're sending you to live in Australia. And that was a penal colony. For a little side note, when I was in high school, there was a foreign exchange student. That's someone that comes and lives in your country and goes to your school for a year. And she was from Australia. And I used to tease her, and I would take anything that I owned that was expensive, and I would pull it away from her because I pretended like she was a criminal, because Australia was a penal colony. I hope you appreciate that small portion of my personal life. And by 1868, Britain had completely ended public executions. Public. They used to, when they took these criminals and they put them to death, they did it in big public squares, and huge crowds came to watch. You know, there was no TV back then, there was no radio. And so when you hear something exciting is happening, everybody wants to run and see it. And so everybody ran and watched a criminal get murdered. So in 1868, they ended public executions. They ended debtor's prison. What's a debtor's prison? Well, debt, T-E-B-T, debt is when you owe someone money. If you owe me money, you have a debt. If I owe, I don't know, Dr. Craig money, I have a debt. And they used to put people in jail that didn't repay their debts. If one of you borrowed money from, or no, let's talk about your dad. If Samir's dad borrows money from Sid's dad, but doesn't ever pay Sid's dad back, he'd go to prison for that. They ended that. And they also worked on improving conditions in prisons, because they were bad places, prisons. It was rough. All kinds of social change happened during this time. Public schools started, labor unions grew bigger and bigger, and as labor unions are growing, Working conditions are getting better because that's what labor unions are for. And government jobs started being given on merit, not because of money. Merit, not money. So merit means your ability. Money, most of the government jobs were just held by rich people. That was it. If you're rich, you got a government job. It didn't matter how smart you were or how dumb you were. If you were rich and you wanted a government job, it was yours. Well, now, during the industrial age, they started hiring people and putting them in government jobs because they were actually smart and they could do the job. And in 1918, women age 30 and up got the right to vote. It wasn't until 1928 that women below the age of 30 could vote. Then we have the Irish question. The Irish question. What is the Irish question? Okay, so Ireland, I gave you guys a little talk the other day on Ireland, so I hope you remember where Ireland is in your head. The British had been conquering and taking over the island of Ireland since the 1100s. From the 1100s to the 1600s, they took more and more and more of Ireland. Like if this is Ireland, in the 1100s, they had this part. England's over here. They took this part, and maybe by the 1200s, they had this part. And by the 1300s, they had this part. And by the 1400s, they had this part. And then they just kind of ruled Ireland. And the actual Irish people were kept really, really, really poor. They were basically slaves. They were peasants, they were poor, and the British owned all their land. And the British forced the Irish to grow food for them. But the Irish weren't allowed to eat it. They grew the food for the British and then put it on boats and sent it over to England. Well, the Irish, as you might be able to tell from this, the Irish weren't very happy about that. And now there's this nationalism that's running all around the world, and the Irish really want their own country. And they're really upset with the British because they treat them so horribly. And then a blight happened. A blight is when one particular produce that you grow doesn't do very well. So the Irish, even though they were growing all this food, they weren't allowed to eat it. They had to send everything they were growing over to England. The only thing the Irish could afford to eat was potatoes. It's pretty much all they ate. That was it. They were very unhealthy people, and they just ate potatoes. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, every day, potatoes. Well, a blight hit the potatoes. And so the potatoes were not good. They weren't growing, and the ones that were growing were sickly. And so the Irish were literally starving while they were farming and making all this food for the British. They're not eating anything. They're eating sick potatoes. and they're starving. People are watching their children starve to death in front of them while they have fields full of food. But they can't eat that food because it belongs to the British. And if the British find out that the Irish are eating their food, they'll kill them. So it was a really, really bad time. Things were really suffering. It was bad. The Irish were really, really angry. And so there was this in England, in Britain, the British had the Irish question. What are we going to do about Ireland? What are we going to do about what's going on over there? And finally, in 1914, Britain agreed to let Ireland rule itself. Britain said, you still belong to us. You're British, but you can have your own government. You can make your own government. You can make your own rules and your own laws, but you belong to us. And then in 1921, Ireland got their own freedom. Ireland became an independent nation. And now we move on to France. France. So you remember the whole revolution that we talked about and how they went through everything in France only to wind up with a king again. Well, in 1848, they had another revolution. They had another revolution. And they wound up with another Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. His name was Napoleon III. And Napoleon III didn't help the people of France any either. All he did was rule like a severe dictator. He didn't care what anyone else said. Everyone had to do his thing. And he wasn't a very good leader. All kinds of crap happened under him. He helped Italy. I'm not going to write that. I'm just going to look at you and talk. He helped Italy. So do you remember, I think it was the last lecture that I did that I said that Italy had been separate and they joined together? Well, he actually helped them do that. Napoleon III helped them join together as one nation. And they were going against the Austrians because Austria wasn't just a country, it was an empire. And the Austrian Empire was trying to take over part of Italy. And Napoleon III helped Italy fight off the Austrians and join together as one. But then, as soon as Italy was joined together as one and they were strong, they turned on France. So it's like not real cool. Also, what else? Napoleon III wanted to be the leader of Mexico. And he put in a puppet. Like a puppet leader is someone that just does anything that you say. He put in a puppet leader who is Maximilian to Mexico. But the Mexicans crazy revolted, went against that and said, no way, we don't want France leading us, and got rid of him. Then What else? Then France got in a fight with Prussia. I'm sure you remember in the last lecture, I said that the Prussian, all of those different groups around Prussia that were all Germanic people, they joined together and made the country of Germany. This is right before that happened, and Prussia still exists. Well, Prussia and France got into a war. Prussia won, and Prussia captured Napoleon III. Well, when Napoleon III was captured, the people of France were like, hey, what are we going to do now? Our king has been captured. We don't have a leader. And there was a new uprising. And this is now the Third Republic of France. Why is it called the Third Republic? Because a republic is when you vote for your leader. That's what a republic is. It's when the people vote for their leader. So they had overthrown the king, and this is a long time ago, last unit, overthrown the king, started a republic, but then the republic fell and they got a king, and then we didn't really talk about it. I touched on it at the beginning of this lecture. In 1848, there was another uprising, another revolt, and they started a republic, but it didn't happen because we got Napoleon III. Now, Napoleon III has been captured by Prussia, and there's a third republic. This republic had lots of different political parties, lots and lots and lots of different political parties. Just in case you don't know what a political party is, in the United States, we have the Democrats and the Republicans. And when you want to vote for president or vote for governor or vote for whatever, you can either vote for the Democrat or the Republican. And in England, they just have a couple parties, and those are your only choices. But in France, they've got lots and lots and lots and lots of different political parties that you can choose from. By the early 1900s in France, they had gotten better wages for workers. They had lower the working hours. People weren't working 16 hours a day anymore. They had made lots and lots of safety regulations. There were free public schools. And they did a separation of church and state. And what that means is before, the church had a whole lot of control over the government. The church had a lot of control about the laws that were made. And during this time, in the early 1900s, France said, maybe that's not right. Maybe we shouldn't have the church making our rules for us. And they said, the church can exist. You can have a church, but you're not going to have anything to do with the government. And women, while they fought and fought and fought and fought for rights, women didn't get to vote in France until 1945. And I know that sounds like a really long time ago for you. So let me tell you, my parents were born in 1952. So like my grandparents were already adults and already married. before women in France could even vote. All right, now we're on to the United States. United States, during this time, during the 1800s, was the great time of expansion. Expansion, to expand, to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. There was this idea in America, just kind of in the American psyche, that people wanted America to be sea to sea. That means the Atlantic to the Pacific, the one side of the land all the way to the other. They wanted all of that to be the United States. And that was called Manifest Destiny. When they wanted to expand, and they did. Manifest destiny. To manifest means to make, and your destiny is your future. They manifested their destiny by talking about it. They said, we're going to make America bigger, and they did. I have a picture to show you. Okay, so this brown part, just the brown part, not Florida down here, just this brown part was all the United States. This is all there was at the beginning of the 1800s. They bought all this white land from France. All of this was from France. They got this blue part from Canada. They got this yellow part from Great Britain. They just took this blue part here. It was part of Mexico, and they just took it. They said, this is ours. They got this green part down here from Spain. And all of this pink part they got from war with Mexico, because America was coming further and further and further and further west, and they were trying to claim all this land. They claimed this, and when they claimed this is when Mexico went to war with them. But Mexico lost, and the United States won, and they got all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And then there were some people that wanted all of this. They wanted Mexico, they wanted Canada. It never quite got that far. They annexed Hawaii. They took Hawaii, the exact America, the United States of America took Hawaii the same way they took Texas. They just took it. They said, it belongs to us now, it's ours. And they bought Alaska. Alaska's not really down here by Mexico. It's way up at the top, up here. They bought Alaska from Russia. And there were some people that wanted all of Canada and all of Mexico, but it didn't work out. They kind of stopped there. They got their manifest destiny east to west. And it took about 100 years to go all the way from here, all the way across. Now I go back to our notes. And in 1776, what happened in 1776? What was that happened in 1776? The Declaration of Independence. And in this, it said rich white male landowners could vote. By the 1830s, so that's about 40 years later, most white men could vote. most white men could vote. There were two really major movements in the 1800s in America. Two major movements. One was women's rights, and one was abolition. Abolition is slavery, ending slavery. There was actually a war fought in the United States over slavery. I can go back to that map and show you. If you were to kind of draw a line right here, right across the middle of the country, all of this part down here, and not many people lived over here, we're mostly talking about this part. Everybody down here was pro-slavery, and people up here were anti-slavery. South wanted slaves, the North did not want slaves, and they fought a war over it. And I wish I had more time to go into it, but I really don't. So there was a war fought, and the North won. And because the North won, slavery was ended. It kind of sucked for the African Americans, for the Black people, the slaves. I mean, I don't mean that it was bad for them to end slavery, but do you remember in the last lecture when I was talking about when serfdom ended in Russia, the people that had lived on that land now didn't even have the land. Well, it's kind of the same thing. When slavery ended in America, these people had no education at all. They couldn't read or write. They didn't have any money at all. They had been slaves. They didn't have any money at all. They didn't have any education at all. And suddenly they're just told, okay, you're free now. And that was it. It wasn't like the government helped them with anything. They just said, okay, you're free, go. They didn't have anything. And life was really, really hard for them. Life is still today really hard because they started with nothing. And let's see, what else? In 1870, the ex-slaves were given the right to vote. Males, men, not women, right to vote. But counties, cities, states made these rules that made it almost impossible for them to vote. They would make tests like, you have to be able to pass this test before we'll let you vote. You got a legal right to vote, but you have to pass this test first. Well, they can't read and write. If they can't read, how are they going to pass a test? And it was just horrible. There were all these rules made. Segregation. They made these awful rules. Segregation means to separate. And white people weren't allowed, or Black people weren't allowed to go into the same store as white people were. Some restaurants that served food, they would serve Black people, but only out of the back door and to go. Like, they couldn't go in and actually eat in the restaurant. That was for white people. And it was bad. Like, restrooms, public restrooms were for white people only. So those rules, this is moving forward, but it wasn't really until the 1960s that all that changed. The 1960s. My parents were almost your age when segregation ended. So that was a little jump. We're going back to 1870 now, and there were monopolies that controlled everything. So the rich people just kept getting richer and richer and richer, but the poor people stayed poor, and life was kind of miserable for them. And in America, it wasn't really until the 1900s when things started getting better. Labor unions got big, and wages were set, and public schools began. And what else? Labor union, wages, public schools, safety. There were safety rules made. Hours were shortened. And in 1920, women won the right to vote. Right to vote. So that's it. This lecture right here was about how societies changed in the different countries. So what I really want you to know, and what's going to be really, really important, is that you need to be able to tell me how things changed in Britain during the industrial age, how they changed in France in the industrial age, and how they changed in the United States in the industrial age. And with the United States, make sure to include manifest destiny. You're going to have to be able to tell me what manifest destiny is and how it happened. Okay, bye guys. I hope you enjoyed Unit 2. I know I did. I love teaching history.